I definitely talk a lot about choice on this show, and for a good reason, because a choice has a motive or intention behind it and a consequence. But regardless, free choice is a gift from God. No one else owns it. There's a great term used in Alcoholics Anonymous to describe the condition of an alcoholic, and that is, we have lost the power of choice. So is that actually possible? Unless you don't have a pulse anymore, you actually never lose the power to choose something. However, you may not make rational choices. They may be highly irrational because you're not recognizing your impulsiveness or you're not disciplining your emotions. So, where does transgenderism fall? Is this choice that's made to be entirely just subordinate to your feelings instead of reason or rationality, is it coherent? Is it valid? The desire to transfer your gender may be a valid feeling, but it is very dysfunctional and it is highly abusive to other people. Here's why. All right, first off, to state the obvious, which I really wish I didn't have to do, but everyone was born with one of two things, a penis or a vagina. There is no in between, and you do not get to interchange them. God assigned a sex to you before you were born, okay? And you are born either one sex or the other. So what I said about being abusive to others, let's back that up for a second. What about being abusive or inconsiderate or rejecting what God gave you? Of all the gifts that you have, which are countless if you choose to look at them, you are directly throwing your identity back into God's face and saying, I am unsatisfied with how you created me, and I choose to be something else. I do not choose your will, I choose my will. So, besides Satan acting through you, giving the finger to God, Satan despises God's creation, which is you, meaning a man or a woman, as it was in the garden. That's why he's going after this. It's the most fundamental part of our creation is you are a human being, and then you are either a man or a woman. So as much as he wreaks havoc in the minds of people, he's going after the most fundamental thing right now, which is hysterical. But as we see, there are people who are actually following along with this lunacy, this hallucination. When this is pushed, and it is pushed onto children, it is an attack on children. And it is extremely wicked because, as some of the progressives would say to me, something like, well, you're all about free choice. Why aren't you availing them to their free choice? Well, they've entirely taken God out of schools, so they don't want kids to have that choice to follow God. And when basic, fundamental, secure things are unsecured from a child, what are they supposed to be confident in? Where is their security? How are they expected to walk through life, not even understanding the most basic part of who they are, which is either a man or a woman, one or the other? The satanic left demands that this be open to interpretation and their feelings. Their feelings and emotions should run their life, not logic, not reason, not fundamentals, certainly not science or biology, but feelings. Feelings and emotions grounded in nothing, feet planted firmly in midair. I can feel any way I want at any part of the day for no reason at all. My feelings will change infinitely based on nothing. So there is nothing foundational for the child without reason. And reason itself is one of the main things that's being abused. It is inconsiderate, unreasonable, and abusive that I should have to ask you how you feel so I know how to address you. I can address you in any manner I want to because I have the free choice to follow biology, science, and empirical evidence of your anatomy, and that is the manner I will address you in. And that is what the progressives can't accept. that their feelings about something does not constitute truth. So let's understand feelings a little bit more. With all the things that can be done and accomplished on a daily basis to contribute to the stream of life, someone who is entertaining this choice of gender dysfunction is certainly not doing anything to contribute to the stream of life. They are perpetually consumed with themselves, specifically with pleasing their genitals.
Call 817-264-3468 now to be a guest on the Exorcism Earth show.
You know, if you want to dress towards the opposite sex, and go ahead and do it. It's been done in art and music and many things for a long time. But, well, if you can't figure out what sex you are, you should quarantine yourself, because you should not be walking the streets if you don't even know who you are. We have a world of thinking people out there who would like to help you, but if we have to tap dance and tiptoe around your feelings all day, stay home, go back in your playpen until you can subscribe to reality. You have the right to have a preference, but your preference does not constitute what's right or wrong. You have the freedom to define yourself, but stop demanding other people follow your demands. Okay, so yeah, I'm being mean because I'm telling you the truth. Okay, then I'm mean. Accept it. Truth is truth, and it doesn't need me to say anything. It's true without me. And another thing that seems very obvious is that all of this isn't so much about the sexual identity or like being gay or anything like that, because you're going to do what you are going to do anyway. But now it's not really about that. In fact, it's very little about that. What it's all about is demanding that others do not disagree with you. You're not allowed to have a different viewpoint or a different position or to reject any of this. Okay, so I just called out Satan. He's an idiot. He thinks he can get away with this stuff, but he can't. So if there is never any attention called to these sexual obsessions, then there is no talk about it, and therefore the person will never feel any guilt. Guilt is good. You're supposed to feel guilty when you've done something wrong. But if it's never mentioned, you won't think about that you're doing anything wrong, and therefore it is accepted. You know, guilt is intrinsic. No one can actually make you feel guilty. They could bring something to your attention, and if you do feel guilty, it's because you've done something wrong. It's a contradiction to objective morality. No one owns morality. God owns morality. Satan really is such an imbecile the way he's using us. Now, everyone on the left is going, oh, you don't care about their feelings and you don't know. Well, no, I don't care about your feelings. What I do care about is sanity. If you are suffering with a personality crisis so severe that you do not know which gender you are, you need to get help. But what you should do is leave other people alone. Do not push your illness on others. They are innocent. All right, so all this must sound absolutely like I am against people. I'm not against people. I'm against Satan. I'm against what Satan is doing to people. And if they pay attention and listen, they can disengage from the evil one and stop being abused. So here's my conclusion. Celebrate what God gave you. Men of the world, rejoice in being a man. Watch the Three Stooges. Watch football. Drink beer. Fart with your friends and laugh like heck because it's funny. Embrace your role in the patriarchal family. Be a loving father and a loving husband. God is trusting you to show responsibility and leadership. And women, likewise, be grateful for what you are and confident you can fill the role that God assigned to you. Females, be feminine. Males, be masculine. So remember the next time you hear the phrase, toxic masculinity. Okay. Yeah, just where does that come from? Again, cunning, evil, and stupid. Really stupid. Satan is so stupid. That's one of the stupidest ones I've ever heard. Toxic masculinity. Okay. Being a man, being how God created you is toxic. I mentioned in another episode Monty Python, and in their movie The Meaning of Life, towards the end, right before Mr. Creosote explodes because he eats too much, Eric Idle is sitting at a piano and he's singing a song. He sings a song called... Sorry. He sings a song called "Isn't It Awfully Nice to Have a Penis?" And he goes in oh, that's great. It really is. I'm thankful for stuff like that. All right. I got to go. I got to pee anyway, and God put my plumbing on the outside, so it's a no-brainer. See you guys next time. Thanks for listening.